Me. Joining us now is Alberto Gonzales, former Attorney General under George W. Bush, former White House counsel under George W. Bush, now the Dean of Belmont University's College of Law. Mr. Gonzales, thank you so much for being with us right now. You have a unique perspective on this, having been inside the White House as White House counsel and Attorney General. Is asking the Justice Department to prosecute your political rivals, is that an appropriate use of DOJ?
No, I mean, I think it's a technical matter. As a matter of constitutional authority, the president would have the authority to make that kind of request. But, you know, if the president had asked me to convey that order to the Attorney General, I would have had a very candid conversation with the president as to why that would be inappropriate and dangerous politically. The consequences could be very, very serious. Obviously, if there may be an indication of some kind of wrongdoing, I might have a quiet conversation with the Attorney General or maybe the Deputy Attorney General to just simply say, you know, there are these stories out there. It's just something you ought to look at, and then leave it at that. But to convey an order from the president to do an actual investigation, I think is a very serious situation, and one that I would have also pushed back.
Why is it a serious situation?
Well, because we live in a democracy, and you don't go after your political rivals. Now, obviously, political rivals sometimes do things that are criminal in nature, and when that occurs, then obviously there should be an investigation and a prosecution. But even then, you do so very, very carefully because of possible allegations that you're doing something, you're going after your political rivals for no reason whatsoever. So it's again, I think it's a very, very serious situation. One that requires a delicate touch because, you know, on the one hand, as White House counsel, your job is to represent the institution of the presidency. On the other hand, you know, you want to make sure that the president has a concern about actual wrongdoing, or if the president has a concern that the Department of Justice is not doing its job, then it is legitimate to have a conversation with the department to find out, well, what's going on here and why hasn't something been done here when it looks like, in fact, there has been some kind of wrongdoing.
So you just told me we live in a democracy. In a democracy, you don't go after your political rivals. What does it tell you that the President of the United States doesn't appear to see it that way?
Well, again, I think the president is under, every president is under a great deal of stress and pressure, and sometimes you make statements that you probably shouldn't make. You muse out loud, and you may ask a staffer to do something.
Do you really think that's what happened here?
I don't know what happened here, John. You know, I don't know this president. I knew George W. Bush, and I would have a pretty good antenna about what he was going through and what he really intended. But I don't know Donald Trump, and so it's really not fair for me to speculate as to what was motivating him and what motivates him now going forward with respect to these kinds of reported requests.
Let me just tell you, the timeline here was that he was asking Don McGahn to tell DOJ to prosecute his political rivals as recently as the spring of 2018. So he'd been in the White House for a long time, long enough to know that presidents aren't supposed to do this type of thing. And then CNN is also reporting that the president repeatedly talked to the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein and the now acting Attorney General Matt Whittaker, wanting to know updates of what DOJ was doing in terms of prosecuting Hillary Clinton. This doesn't seem like a one-off, does it?
No, and one of the things we would have done differently, that conversation would not have occurred directly between the president and the Deputy Attorney General or the Chief of Staff. That conversation would have occurred through me or through Andy Carr, the Chief of Staff. You want to protect the president from having those kind of conversations directly with the prosecutors. And so if, in fact, those conversations occurred, I think it's one of the reasons why we're having this conversation today and why people are questioning the motive behind these conversations between the president and senior officials at the Department of Justice.
You say you're concerned. Are you scared? Are you scared that this president sees it the way he does?
Am I scared? Again, I don't know. My sense is this president often says things that reflects frustration and maybe a little bit of desperation. but nothing really comes of it. And fortunately, in this particular instance, it appears that the White House counsel did his job. And again, even if there had been some communication with the Department of Justice, I have confidence in Rod Rosenstein and other senior officials at the department. They would have done what would have been expected by all of us as American citizens.
Do you think Don McGahn, in a way, saved the presidency?
No, that's a very, very broad statement. I think Don McGahn did his job. I'd like to believe that any White House counsel in that position would have done the very same thing. And I mean, that's your job as White House counsel, to protect those kind of communications between the White House and the Department of Justice.
You said any White House counsel in that position would have done the same thing. Can you ever imagine you being in that position with George W. Bush?
Well, you know, President Bush was sometimes frustrated with the performance of a cabinet official, and he might express that frustration privately. I think what we've seen differently from this president is that he appears to have no qualms whatsoever about expressing his frustrations, his criticism of the performance of cabinet officials, and that makes him different from previous presidents. From my perspective, it would make my job as White House counsel certainly a lot more challenging, if not more interesting.
It's not more interesting. That's one way to look at it. Let me just read you the second article of impeachment for Richard Nixon. And Carl Bernstein brought this up to me overnight, and I'm not suggesting that President Trump should be impeached, but Carl was saying, just think of the similarities between what was being discussed to impeach Richard Nixon and the similarities to now. The second article impeachment in there says, in disregard of the rule of law, he knowingly misused the executive power by interfering with agencies of the executive branch, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Criminal Division, and the Office of Watergate's Special Prosecution Force of the Department of Justice and of the Central Intelligence Agency in violation of his duty to take care of the laws be faithfully executed. Do you see any similarities with some of the questions being raised about what President Trump has asked and wondered about, and in some cases done, with what Article 2 in Richard Nixon's impeachment hearings asked?
Well, the difference, of course, is the fact that, in fact, those kinds of actions were ordered by the president, and that did not happen here. The other thing we also need to keep in mind, and we're talking about articles of impeachment, we're not talking about any kind of criminal action, any kind of obstruction of justice or anything of that nature. Now we're talking about really a political process, and that is whether or not the President of the United States should be impeached by the House and then subsequently removed by the Senate. But we're a long way from that. But again, sometimes I think this president in particular says things out of frustration, but nothing comes of it. And so long as we have good people serving in these senior positions, both within the White House and the Department of Justice, I have to remain confident that the rule of law is going to be respected.
Is Matt Whittaker, now acting Attorney General, one of these good people you are now trusting?
You know, I don't know Matt Whittaker that well. Obviously, he was appointed U.S. Attorney when I worked in the White House, and so I was involved in his appointment as the U.S. Attorney. I think there are questions about whether or not his appointment is constitutional. OLC, the Office of Legal Counsel of the Department of Justice, has opined that it is lawful. I relied upon OLC when I was White House counsel and as the Attorney General. Therefore, I'm going to rely upon OLC in this particular case in their judgment. But I will say that OLC has been wrong in the past, and the courts may step in and say this is another instance where OLC is wrong and the appointment is invalid. But I understand the main concern I think most people have about Whittaker is the fact that he's now overseeing the Mueller investigation. I also have questions about whether or not it would be appropriate for him to recuse himself from that, and I'm hopeful that he's consulted with the career ethics officials in the Department of Justice, and they've informed him that he can stay in overseeing the Mueller investigation, and that he's doing that job now.
Alberto Gonzales, a lot of questions I think we all have. Thank you for coming and helping raise some of them with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, John, great conversation. Let's talk about it. Joining us.